Good.
Got it. Okay.
Tervetuloa seuraamaan tätä YAPSin Q&A-sarjaa. Tänään kysymme, varastaako Israel palestiinalaisilta vettä? YK määritteli vuonna 2010 oikeuden veteen ihmisoikeudeksi. Kysymys vedestä on yksi polttavista kysymyksistä Lähi-idässä ja kaikkialla maailmassa, missä kärsitään kuivuudesta ja veden niukkuudesta. Vesivarannot ei noudata tiukkoja valtiorajoja, ja niiden jakaminen ja niistä huolehtiminen on iso alueellinen haaste kaikilla alueilla, missä kärsitään konflikteista. Monet palestiinalaiset kansalaisjärjestöt syyttävät Israelia veden epäoikeudenmukaisesta jakamisesta alueella. Haluamme selvittää vastauksia esitettyihin syytteisiin, ja siksi meillä on tänään haastateltavana Jonna Schiffmiller, joka on tutkija kansalaisjärjestöjen toimintaa tarkkailevassa NGO Monitor-järjestössä. Hän johti ryhmää, joka on laatinut raportin Analysis of Palestinian Water Issues and Israel's Role, joka myös julkaistiin tänä syksynä vastauksena Israelia vastaan esitettyihin syytöksiin. Jonna, welcome. Thank you for taking your time to answer our questions.
A pleasure to speak to you.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go straight to the heart of the issue. So Palestinian NGOs are complaining of an extremely inequitable distribution of water, and that the Israelis get the lion's share of the water resources while the Palestinians are continuously denied basic human rights, including the right to water. So is Israel committing water apartheid?
I think that the evidence makes that claim very tenuous at best. And the reason for that is that Israel has gone above and beyond its legal requirements in providing water to Palestinians. So I want to start back actually in 1967 when Israel takes over the West Bank. According to a study by Israeli hydrologist Professor Chaim Wirtzman, who is a world-renowned hydrologist, has appeared in UN fora speaking on these issues. In 1967, when Israel took over control of the West Bank from Jordan, there were only 4 Palestinian villages that were connected to running water. By 1995, on the eve of the Oslo Accords, that number had risen to over 300. So even before Israel had entered into any sort of agreement with the PLO, it had already on its own volition connected over 300 Palestinian villages to running water. In the years since Oslo, that number has obviously increased, and up until about 2010, it was 96%, I believe, of Palestinians living in the West Bank had access to running water. And so claims that Israel is in any sort of way deliberately trying to prevent Palestinians from accessing water are just simply untrue.
So the allocation and management of water resources is a major cross-border regional issue everywhere, but especially in areas like the Middle East, which suffer from drought and many conflicts. The Oslo Accords, under which the Palestinian Authority was also established, is the legal basis on which the parties have agreed on the use of water resources. So what was actually agreed in the Oslo Accords on water sharing?
Sure. So there were a number of provisions in Oslo that dealt with the issue of water. And some of them had to do with, the joint management of water, and other had to do with drilling opportunities and opportunities for expanding water. So first of all, Israel and the Palestinians agreed in Oslo to the amount of water Israel would provide Palestinians in the West Bank, as well as Gaza. And it's important to know that these figures have increased over the years. So in the Oslo Accords, for instance, Gaza was allocated 5 cubic meters of water from Israel a year. That number has now increased to 10 a couple of years ago, and earlier this year, Israel announced plans to increase that to 15, so tripling what it had agreed to in Oslo. And similarly in the West Bank as well, Israel now provides over 86 cubic meters of water a year, with plans to increase that to 93. We've seen all sorts of discussions within government ministries in the Israel Water Authority, in the Knesset, of this sort of master plan to increase Palestinian access to water and improve Palestinian water infrastructure. As far as some of the other provisions of Oslo are concerned, it allowed for the Palestinians to drill in the West Bank, and it also created what's called the Joint Water Committee. And I think this in particular is a very, very fundamental body for understanding both what was agreed to in Oslo, but also how we got to where we are today. The Joint Water Committee was made up of Israeli and Palestinian experts, and it was, as its name suggests, supposed to jointly manage the development of water and waste infrastructure for Israelis and Palestinians living in the West Bank. And in 2010, the Palestinian Authority boycotted the Joint Water Committee. They did so for over 7 years. And the reason that they boycotted it was that the JWC would, as was agreed to in Oslo, was also engaged in infrastructure projects for Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And because the Palestinian Authority didn't want to advance those infrastructure projects, it boycotted the entire committee. And this essentially set back Palestinian water and waste infrastructure by several years. And so, I'm sure, I don't know if you have other questions about this going forward, but, in the UN report that I think you referenced, there was talk of the state of Palestinian water infrastructure and the Palestinian waste infrastructure. But what's important to remember is that because the PA boycotted the Joint Water Committee for the better part of a decade, that has led to a lag in developing and improving that infrastructure.
Actually, in the UN report that was published this autumn, there's a claim that water arrangements in the Oslo Accords have proven inequitable, and they list as key constraints also this boycotting of this committee, but also that Israel is reluctant to agree to project proposed by Palestinians, and also that Israel is restriction movement and access for Palestinians. So what do you think about this?
Well, I guess I have a couple of things to say. First of all, Israel, in response to the boycott by the Palestinians of the Joint Water Committee, made changes to the decision-making process in that committee, and has now led to the fact that in areas A and B of the West Bank, where the overwhelming majority of Palestinians live, they no longer require approval from the Joint Water Committee to carry out water and waste infrastructure. So water and waste infrastructure approval by the JWC for Palestinians in the West Bank is limited only to Area C, which represents a fraction of the West Bank Palestinian population. That's the first thing that's important to remember. Secondly, as I said, Israel is both through these plans to increase Palestinian access to water to 93 cubic meters, and through a variety of other projects that Israel is advancing with regard to sewage and wastewater. Israel has taken upon itself a number of projects to help improve Palestinian water infrastructure. And I can tell you that in reading reports from the Israeli state comptroller, there have been all sorts of suggestions and recommendations made in how Israel can continue to advance the cause of developing this infrastructure, both bilaterally with the Palestinians, but also by engaging the international donor community. So certainly within Israel, there is an awareness of the need to improve Palestinian water infrastructure, and we've seen concrete steps that have been taken in order to do so.
Actually, these Palestinian NGOs were used as sources in the report of the Office of the United Nations High Commissioners for Human Rights, presented to the Human Rights Council this autumn. Can you tell something about these Palestinian NGOs? Like, I think Al-Haq is one of the sources that were used for this UN report.
Well, in the case of Al-Haq, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that on October 22nd of this year, the Israeli Ministry of Defense declared Al-Haq to be a terrorist organization because of its apparent ties to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, which is designated as a terrorist organization not only here in Israel, but also in the European Union, in the United States, in Canada, and in other places around the world. And so that certainly is something to keep in mind. Crucially, when it comes to the sourcing in this report, we found a number of instances where, as you mentioned, there are very politicized, one-sided Palestinian NGOs that were sourced to. We also found a number of claims that had minimal sourcing or no apparent sourcing. So, where we saw an instance where the UN report cited to another report, and then you look in that report and there's no claim, there's no source for that claim in that report. We saw an instance where a claim was sourced to a caption in a picture in some other report put out by a different NGO. And so in a number of instances, the sourcing was very problematic and didn't live up to the international standards that we would expect. And crucially, there are no sources from the Israeli government. And so these, according to the UN report, they approached the government. The government didn't want to engage with them. And we can sort of debate whether or not that's prudential and that's wise on the part of the Israeli government. But certainly from the perspective of a reader who's engaging with this material and reading this report, it's very important to keep in mind this is a Palestinian and extremist NGO version of what's going on. It's not culling from official Israeli documentation in any way.
Mm, mm, mm. So, well, anyway, these NGOs and the UN report as well are also complaining that Israel regularly destroys and confiscates water-related infrastructure from the Palestinians. So why is Israel destroying Palestinian water infrastructure?
So there are instances where Israel is demolishing water infrastructure. The context here is crucial. The context is not one of water, yes or no, although I will say something about that actually afterwards, because there are instances in which it does have to do with water per se. But by and large, most of the claims surrounding this issue have to do with demolitions carried out by Israel of communities built in Area C. And the issue at hand here is not water, but the issue at hand is whether or not these communities are built legally. And we've seen a number of instances where Palestinians erect structures, try to build in a firing zone, in a closed military zone. They appeal to the Israeli courts. The Israeli courts issue order demolitions. We've seen appeals to the Supreme Court that have been where the Supreme Court will uphold the original order to demolish the structures. And so when Israel's already demolishing illegally constructed structures, yes, there will probably be some water infrastructure as well. But the real issue at hand is not water, it's illegal building. And I think the other thing that's important to mention in this case, we've seen a number of instances in the last couple of years where repeated demolitions have taken place in the same communities over and over again over a period of several months. And we've seen this phenomena whereby structures are constructed illegally, there's a demolition notice that's issued, demolition takes place, and then the structures are once again constructed in an area where the residents know that Israel intends to demolish them, and where Israel and the Israeli courts have declared the structures to be illegal. And so that's really the heart of the matter. The other thing that I will say, though, in the instances where we do need to talk about water, the issue of illegal drilling, I think, is also crucial and critical, and that does tie into this a little bit. Israeli water authority reports from 2018 and 2019 have shown over 140 cases of illegal drilling carried out by Palestinians. And this, of course, affects not only Israelis, but Palestinians as well. The illegal drilling has adverse effects on water access in other parts of the West Bank. It can have adverse effects on sewage, on the ability to maintain the water levels in the aquifer that both Israelis and Palestinians use. So to the extent that there is demolitions and things like that are connected to water specifically, oftentimes it has to do with all sorts of acts of illegal drilling or piracy.
Mm. Yeah, water pollution is also a problem in the West Bank and Gaza. A representative of the Palestinian Authority complained at the Glasgow Climate Summit that Israel policies are the worst environmental threat to Palestinians. What do you think about this?
So the issue of pollution and environmental damage is a crucial one, and it's one that's been dealt with by Israeli reports. The Israeli Knesset put out a report in 2016 that actually looked specifically at this issue and found that I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but I believe over 90% of untreated waste in the West Bank came from Palestinian communities, and if I remember the figures accurately, over 80% of waste produced by Palestinian communities in the West Bank went untreated. And this has had negative effects both on the local environment within the West Bank, but has also led to pollution in streams and valleys and water sources within Israel itself. And so this ties back into the whole issue of boycotting the Joint Water Committee. If Palestinians had not boycotted that committee, there would be better infrastructure in place now to handle and treat sewage. And that would obviously have beneficial effects for the environment, both for Palestinians and for Israelis. And so a number of projects that Israel is currently advancing, like the Kidron Valley project in Jerusalem, will hopefully mitigate some of the environmental damage that's going on right now, and will hopefully bring, and will hopefully help improve the environmental situation in the area.
Yeah. Do you want to comment on this NGO claim that Israel has turned the Joint Water Committee into a forum of blackmail? These NGOs claim that Israel approves major Palestinian projects only if the Palestinians agree to Israeli demands to systems which are benefiting Israeli settlements.
Well, essentially what these NGOs are saying is that they take issue with the basic tenets and principles of the Oslo Accords, which is what set up the Joint Water Committee. Oslo recognizes the fact that there are Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and it deals with the water issue with the understanding that there will be Israeli settlements in the West Bank. And so when the committee was set up, it was understood that it would advance infrastructure for Israeli communities, for Israeli settlements, and it would advance infrastructure for Palestinians as well. And so the hardline approach, which is essentially saying we will not advance our own Palestinian infrastructure if Israeli infrastructure is also enhanced, is self-defeating. And that's essentially what the NGOs here are adopting, is a very obstructionist hardline stance that says we would rather, not improve our own water infrastructure, not improve our own sewage treatment infrastructure, just to prevent Israeli communities that are already established in the West Bank from getting infrastructure improvements there.
So it's kind of these NGOs which claim to be human rights, kind of promoting human rights and access to water, have actually political agenda. So they're masquerading kind of their political agenda as a human rights cause. Yeah.
Right. I would agree with that. Yeah. Yes.
So what kind of efforts Israel has been doing to the Palestinians to help the Palestinians in their access to clean water and to improve their water infrastructure, like the treatment of sewage? So you were already telling something about the Kidron Valley project. I found actually that some of these NGOs which claim to be human rights NGOs and kind of concerned about the water issue, claiming that this sewage water treatment system in Kidron Valley is somehow a human rights problem, which I find a bizarre thing, because in these same NGOs are claiming in some other instances that Israel has the duty to provide these services. So do you want to comment on this?
Sure, it is. I agree. It is bizarre and almost dystopian, some of the criticisms of the project. The project is designed to treat waste from Palestinian communities as well as from Israeli ones. And not only will it handle Palestinian waste, which will have beneficial environmental effects for everyone involved, but it's also designed to provide wastewater to Palestinian farmers for agricultural use. One of the things that repeated Israeli studies have found is that oftentimes for Palestinian agriculture, there is too much use of what could otherwise go for drinking water. And that's obviously an inefficient use of drinking water that leads to problems elsewhere in the system. And so it would be better if there were more use of wastewater, which is common practice in Israel for agricultural use. And so this project is intended to provide Palestinian farmers in the Jericho region with wastewater to conduct agriculture. So this will treat Palestinian waste and will also allow for more drinking water access to Palestinians, because instead of using that drinking water for irrigation and other agricultural uses, they'll have access to more wastewater. So I really can't understand the criticisms. I don't think that it's difficult for me to see that these criticisms are made in good faith.
Mm-hmm. So I think these were my questions this time. So thank you for answering this, and I hope.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.